It was an overcast morning in the quiet village of Elmwood, where everyone knew each other, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The town was small, tucked away in the countryside, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. But that changed when the police were called to a crumbling, ivy-covered house at the end of Ash Lane. The house belonged to Mrs. Agnes Whitlock, a reclusive elderly woman in her 80s. She'd lived there for as long as anyone could remember, always keeping to herself, rarely seen except for occasional trips to the local market. People whispered about her. Some said she was a witch, others claimed she had lost her mind after her husband died mysteriously decades ago. But now, something far worse had surfaced. Detective Miles Carter, a seasoned investigator who had seen it all, was sent to investigate. When he arrived, he was greeted by a strange scene. Mrs. Whitlock was sitting in her rocking chair, staring out of the window as if in a trance. At her feet lay the lifeless body of a young man, his face contorted in sheer terror. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, just the look of pure fear etched into his features. Carter crouched down to inspect the body. His name was Daniel Mills, a local handyman who had been hired by Mrs. Whitlock to fix some things around the house. He'd gone missing 3 days earlier, and now he lay dead in the very home he'd been hired to repair. As Carter questioned Mrs. Whitlock, she seemed confused, her voice soft and shaky. "I don't know what happened," she murmured. "He came to fix the floorboards, but he started screaming. I didn't know what to do." The more Carter probed, the more unsettling the case became. Neighbors spoke of strange noises coming from the house late at night, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes distant screams. One neighbor even claimed to have seen a shadowy figure standing at Mrs. Whitlock's window in the dead of night. Carter searched the house thoroughly, but nothing seemed out of place. The only oddity was a collection of old, dusty photographs Mrs. Whitlock kept in a box under her bed. They were pictures of her younger self, her late husband, and, curiously, many other young men, all around Daniel's age, standing in the same house. None of these men had been seen in town for years. The deeper Carter dug into Mrs. Whitlock's past, the darker it became. Rumors of her husband's death were still unsolved, and several men who had worked for her over the years had mysteriously vanished without a trace. The stories seemed too strange, too coincidental. Days passed, and Carter grew more suspicious. There was something sinister in that house, something Mrs. Whitlock wasn't telling him. One night, after gathering some final evidence, he decided to return to her home alone. The air was thick with tension as he approached the old house, the moonlight casting long shadows over its decaying walls. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Carter's flashlight flickered as he made his way through the dimly lit rooms, stopping when he reached the basement. There was an old, locked door at the bottom of the stairs, one he hadn't noticed before. Breaking the lock, he swung the door open, revealing a dark, narrow room. The walls were lined with old mirrors, and in the center of the room was a large, ornate chest. His breath caught in his throat as he opened it. Inside were more photographs, hundreds of them. But these were different. The faces of the men in the pictures were twisted, warped as if they had been caught in the grip of something unspeakable. And then Carter saw it, a reflection in one of the mirrors, a shadow standing right behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Heart racing, he hurried back upstairs, only to find Mrs. Whitlock standing in the hallway, her eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling light. "You shouldn't have gone down there, Detective," she said, her voice now unnervingly calm. Carter tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. The air grew heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around him, and that's when he saw it. The mirrors in the hallway, all reflecting something that wasn't there. A figure. Or was it figures? He couldn't tell. It was as if something was watching him, not from outside, but from within the mirrors. Mrs. Whitlock stepped closer, her frail hand reaching out to touch his arm. Her skin felt cold, like death itself. "You see, I've lived a very long life," she whispered. "Longer than anyone should. But there's a price for that. I've had to borrow from others. You understand, don't you?" Carter's eyes widened in horror as the truth dawned on him. The young men, the missing workers, they hadn't vanished. Mrs. Whitlock had taken them, draining their lives to sustain her own. Before Carter could react, he felt an icy grip tighten around his throat. His reflection in the nearest mirror twisted, mirroring the terror that had claimed Daniel Mills. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The next morning, the townsfolk found Detective Carter's body in Mrs. Whitlock's house, his face frozen in fear, just like Daniel's. Mrs. Whitlock was nowhere to be found, the house abandoned and as silent as the grave. But the mirrors remained, and if you looked closely, you could still see Carter's reflection, trapped forever, along with the others. And somewhere, far away, an old woman lived on, eternally.